think this will be the beginning of a response to yourself there, Corey, Professor Anton, and your response to my video about the universe not having a self, which is triggered by that phrase, you know, we are the universe becoming conscious of itself, or the variants of that. Carl Sagan said something similar, which Anika Garrett, thank you for naming which Anika, gave me the correct quotation for, something like we are the cosmos becoming aware, something. Your own version of that, Corey, which is we are the universe haunting itself as another, which I haven't completely imaged in my mind yet, but I'm working on. You know, and Alan Watts says it, and it's yeah, it's used quite a bit, you know, for all various kinds of reasons. And I haven't watched all of your video yet. I've done the opportunity, but I did want to just flesh out what I was saying a little bit more, because I think it just makes some clarifications. Because there's several things about it. One is that is my interest in that phrase, which, as I said in my previous video, it's partly because my interest in it is partly because I recognise it as a kind of piece of propaganda. It's sometimes useful to have a phrase like that for reasons as I said in the previous video. But my main interest in it is more to do with how it's working poetically. You know, I'm interested in poetry and how poetry does the things it does, and how things which don't immediately present themselves as poetry, just normal speech, or slightly elevated speech in this case, also does things that poetry does, has actual physiological effects, cognitive effects, makes your mind move in mysterious ways. And I think that's one of those phrases. I mean, it is a little bit of a cliche now, so I think it's perhaps less so these days. But certainly when Carl Sagan came out with that phrase, it's kind of designed to produce a sense of kind of awe and reverence and kind of gobsmacked recognition of the majesty of the universe. It has that kind of an effect, you know. And you still get it, you know, if someone makes a video that has that phrase and anybody hasn't come across it before, there'll be quite often a comment exchange about, ooh, this is a really wild phrase, wow, I wish I could smoke in what you were smoking. You know, it's that kind of spacey, slightly Twilight Zone response, which I think is an actual physiological response that people are having, and a cognitive response. This is the second little response to your video there, Corey, about my video, the universe becoming conscious of itself. I'm just picking up on the very last thing you said there, Corey, which is good. It's this thing about the difference between of and am, kind of. You say that I am conscious of the universe, I am conscious of the universe, which begs the question, what am I? And then you say I is of the universe. So there's a kind of circularity there, or it suggests a logic which does lead you to shorten that down to say that I am the universe becoming conscious of itself, or worse to that effect. And it's a great phrase, you know what I mean? But in a sense it illustrates what I meant in my original video, in which I described it as a kind of poetry. As I say in that video, I described it as the poetry which might be mobilised for kind of ecological, political effect. But it's poetic in its effects on a personal level as well, I think, in terms of how it works in the brain or in the mind or in the thoughts and the psyche. Because there's a huge amount of compression in those sentences, isn't there? When you say, I am conscious of the universe, yeah, kind of, but it's metonymic compression. What's going on there is that obviously consciousness is not one thing. I'm assuming this is the case. It's a whole range of processes, some of which happen inside the body and some of which happen outside, for sure, or which requires things to happen outside the body to be meaningful. But you know, involving sensory engagement, involving the various interoceptive and extraceptive perceptions, involving memory, involving analysis, involving, you know, the kind of felt responses to perceptions, a whole range of different things going on there. And of course, you're not conscious of the universe simultaneously. I think we're in agreement. You see, you're conscious of one bit of it at a time. So it is a massive compression of a complex process, and like all those kind of metonymic compressions, it produces poetic effect. So to say I'm conscious of the universe is good, but I can feel the glimmerings of a kind of awestruck, aspirational language haunting the hind. It's the kind of things it's almost the kind of thing you put on those aspirational posters. You know what I mean? Or that you would record a physicist saying with an auto-tuned background to it. And the converse of that, which says, you know, after you've said I am conscious of the universe, you say, what am I? well, I am of the universe, which again is a massive mnemonic compression. Yes, I am, and you are, and all the rest of these people who either can say they are an I or are mute in the face of that I-ness. Yeah, of course, I am of the universe, but it's a compression of all of the processes, isn't it? It's a compression of the physical and material and chemical and biological and ecological and evolutionary processes. All those systems that I've talked about, metabolic, respiratory processes. Every process that's going on is captured in that of word, isn't it, really? So it's compressed to a minuscule degree, which is why I think it works again as poetry. You know, it works as a tagline on an inspirational poster, and it gives us that kind of slightly spacey, slightly awestruck feeling. Oh yeah, we are lads. It's kind of like that, isn't it? And of course, it's not wrong. I'm not disputing that's the truth. But what I'm doing, of course, is looking under the bonnet of why it's doing that awestruck feeling. Why are those kinds of phrases, you know, apart from possible political application, why are they so? Why people do find them inspiring, or why do people use them to mobilise people's? In some cases, to stop people using their critical faculties, quite honestly. I think when people are awestruck in the face of an inspiring slogan, whatever it may be, quite often their critical faculties fall away. And I think this is one of those phrases which can certainly lead to that. You know, and in the hands of some New Age gurus, and I know you're not a supporter of New Age, and you've been quite critical at times, in the hands of those kind of charlatans, phrases like, you know, the universe becoming conscious of itself, or the variants on that we've talked about, you know, they are used for that kind of effect. They're used as snake oil to to kind of literally grease the gears of a mind that falls in love with awesomeness. You know, so when we say I am the universe and the universe is of me, I am of the universe, and you know, it sounds great, but you can sneak a lot of other crap under that kind of stuff, can't you? Yeah. I mean, the other thing about ofness, which I'll perhaps make a different video about, is ofness has this little grain of possession in it, doesn't it? Of. It's partly out of. You know, it's partly this thing about emergent, out of, which obviously is a problem for what we're talking about here, because we're trying to say that we are not out of, i.e. separate from and different and excluded from the universe. So of has a little bit of that to it, but it also has a bit of the possessive, doesn't it? If something is of something, there's a suggestion that it almost belongs to that something. I'll make a different video about ofness, I think, because it is quite interesting. Okay, another response to your video there, Corey, and this is about ofness and the self. I just want to preface this by the several things, really. Firstly, a distinction between self and consciousness, because you know, consciousness is a term that I'm trying to avoid, and you're talking specifically about. I'm using it as a kind of catch-all for other kinds of processes. But in the video, the universe becoming conscious of itself, it's the self bit that's important. And what I was saying there, of course, was that that thing we call a self is generated by these systems that we call bodies and brains, or something like that. Maybe there are other systems which can do it, but I don't know of any. We know that there are bodies and brains which do produce these things called selves. And I would say that the universe doesn't have those things. And to say that the universe has them through us it's not incorrect, but it's another poetic compression. It's leaving out all the steps in between, between the great big thing and this relatively small thing that we are, in order to produce a poetic effect. But selfness, yeah, I mean, this is quite important, really, and the relationship between selfness and ownership, because part of, and this is why it's myself and its self, because when we're talking about the universe itself, it's partly just it, but it's also its self. You know, in the same way that it's myself or yourself, a self that belongs to something. Myself belongs to me. It's a self that belongs to me. It isn't just some random free-floating self that has no owners. It's not in yourself. It's similarly, And but the universe doesn't. Not only I would say the universe doesn't have a self; it doesn't have a sense of ownership, because self and self-ownership are kindred ideas. And I guess this is Thomas Metzinger. I think he talks about this, but I may be wrong, Corey. But this idea that possession is part of that equation, I think, is really interesting, because he. And I'm not just talking about possession as we understand it in the 21st century, or since the development of mercantile cultures and currency and exchange. I'm talking about a much more intimate sense of ownership, from which those other kinds of ownerships, the ownership that represents price and the ownership that represents exchange value and all those kinds of things. I'm talking about the kind of primordial sense of owning oneself. The kind of ownership which indicates a relationship which is not quite identical, but not separateness. It is kind of self-identity. Being identical to oneself, the self that one owns, and that is owned by. It's that kind of thing, really. And there is a very kind of intimate sense of self-ownership, which, as I say, I think it probably acts as a kind of prototype or archetype for all other kinds of ownership. I can feel a sense of I can kind of feel a sense of ownership to things like my thoughts and my dreams and my hopes and my aspirations and my habits and my history. And I can feel parts of myself which are so close to a sense of ownership that I can't identify the separation. It's just a sense of self-ownership. And then I can kind of sense things which are slightly more peripheral to that. Things like my physical brain, or like my heart and my lungs, or like my knowledge, the things I've read. These are kind of, or the facts that I believe in. And these are kind of owned, and they're quite very close, but they're not quite as proximal. And then there's the more peripheral parts of my body, for example. I can, my arms and legs and my hands, and my fingernails, and my fingerprints on this piece of paper. My fingerprints, there it is, and I can kind of own that. I can feel that there's a mineness to that fingerprint, and there's a mineness to my signature, and a mineness to my handwriting style, which isn't of the body, but it's really close. And I can kind of feel that going out, the mineness of my wedding ring, and the mineness of the things that are important in the photographs of my family and my wallet, and the mineness of my children and my wife and my dog and my car and my house and my, I'm sure you can get a sense of this, but there's a kind of mineness which goes out, and which I can kind of modify proportionately to the extent to which I feel these elements of possessionness. And my country, my language, my world, sure. And sure, to that extent, I am the universe in the sense that I do sense there is a sense of possessive relationship to it. But I'm projecting out to claim that. You know what I mean? I'm projecting out to claim that. And I think its origins are it's turning around an ownership of self, and an ownership which is partially defining of self. So I'm looking down because I wrote something down earlier. I'm just trying to find what it was. No, I can't find it. Yeah, I can't find it. So there's something there about ownership and self-possessed, the self-possessiveness, really. And of, I think I mentioned of in another video, being of the universe is slightly redolent of that being possessed by the universe. So again, I think it's a poetic illusion. I think it's projecting one's own sense of self-ownership and the creation of self through that ownership onto the universe at large. Yeah, I think it's doing something like that. I mean, the other thing about something else about your video, which I'll just mention at the end of this one, which is to do with what you kind of refer to as solipsistic. I think I'm just not explaining myself. I don't say, you say it's because, taken to the logical conclusion, what I'm suggesting is that the only thing I'm aware of is myself, which would be solipsistic. But I'm not really saying that. If it came across, then I didn't phrase it correctly. It's more like I'm aware with myself. You know, if there wasn't a self, a kind of reference points from which awareness proceeds, then I don't think it would make sense to say I am aware. There wouldn't be an I forming the axis of an awareness process. You know what I mean? I mean, I don't think there'd be awareness at all, full stop, but that's, who knows, I know that people